Bienvenidos! Today we're going to learn how to sound out Spanish phrases and how to read aloud in Spanish. Learning how to say phrases and to sound out whole passages in Spanish is the key to becoming fluent in Spanish. So this is a very important step for you as you progress in learning Spanish. But the thing we have to keep in mind is that we should only start trying to sound out longer passages and longer phrases after we've mastered some fundamental building blocks. And those are the Spanish alphabet and some sight words. So if you haven't mastered sight words in the Spanish alphabet, just stop watching the video, go back and look at the video on the alphabet and sight words and numbers and learn those first, because what's going to happen is it's like trying to run before you can walk. If you don't know some of the basic building block sounds, and if you haven't mastered those, then when you're trying to sound out a whole phrase, you're going to be doing a lot of things incorrectly. And we don't want you to practice incorrectly. We want you to practice correctly. So be sure you've mastered the alphabet and sight words and maybe numbers, and then you can start trying to sound out longer phrases and read aloud in Spanish. And once you get to the point where you're ready to start reading aloud, then you're going to actually develop fluency. And this is where fluency really begins. When we think about infants and toddlers and how they know how to say one word or very short phrases, we don't think of them as being fluent. We think of them as learning the language. And that's where you're at right now. But once you can start stringing longer sounds and meanings together into longer phrases, then you're becoming fluent and you're developing fluency. So this is the key to developing fluency, but we really can't use this until we've developed those fundamental building blocks that all infants and toddlers have developed. So we need to go back through that infant and toddler stage, and then we're ready to start developing fluency. Now, there are three things that we need to keep in mind here as we're developing our fluency with phrases and reading aloud. We're going to focus on fluency. We're going to focus also on intonation, which is important, and pronunciation. We're not going to forget or lose some of the pronunciation skills that we've already developed when we learn the alphabet and sight words. Fluency is just hugely important. And what that means is when we talk about fluency, we're stringing a group of sounds together and connecting them. So for the phrase, who is it? ¿Quién es? We don't say ¿quién es? Even though there's a space between the word ¿quién and es, when we are fluent, we're connecting those sounds. And Spanish is especially kind of a fluid musical language, so we're going to connect those sounds. So it becomes ¿quién es? ¿Quién es? And it's almost like it's one word. And so those are the types of things that we're going to have to try to reproduce when we're learning how to sound out phrases and passages. Another really important piece of fluency is intonation. And all that means is that when we're speaking, that we vary the tone of our voice. And this not only is important to maintain reader attention, because nobody wants to listen to a story in monotone, or nobody really enjoys having a conversation with somebody speaking in a monotone, but also it can affect the meaning. If we don't vary our intonation correctly, then we may affect the actual meaning of what we're saying. And here's an example. The word como can be said three different ways with intonation, giving three different meanings. If we wanted to say what, it would be como. And as you can see, my tone is starting low and going up. Como? All right. Now, if we want to say how, like, how did that happen? Como? That starts at the top and goes down. Okay? Como? You can hear my voice drop. And then, if we wanted to say I eat, which also is como, the tone stays flat. Como. Como. Well, maybe it does drop a little bit. Como. But it's not as drastic a drop as the how. So, in other words, I'm just trying to say be sure and pay attention to the intonation when you're listening to how a passage is supposed to sound, and try to reproduce that as much as possible. The other thing I want to point out is we've mastered the alphabet, we've mastered some sight words. When we're trying to string together a longer group of sounds, don't lose sight of all the things that you've already learned about pronunciation. And there are certain things I want you to watch out for that tend to be stumbling blocks for people who are just learning Spanish. Especially pay attention to your vowels, because as an English speaker, for some reason the vowels tend to be a more difficult concept for us to master. Watch out for the silent H. Adjoining vowels especially can sound a little bit different, so we want to pay attention to those sounds. The vowels on the ends of words in Spanish can be important, especially if it's an A or an O, because that will change the gender. The double L, ella, okay, make sure that you make the Y sound instead of the L sound. Ñ, okay. The English Z sound, don't make it. When you're speaking Spanish, that sound does not exist. So even in some words that have an S, we tend to try to make a Z sound. Don't do it. Just, you can't produce the Z sound in Spanish. When you're speaking Spanish, that sound goes away. And accent marks. Be sure that if there's an accent mark in a word, that's where you place the emphasis on the syllable with the accent mark. So here's some example words that have some of these things to watch out for. Hielo, hielo. This H is silent, and the I and E are together, and they make a slightly different sound. It's kind of difficult for us to pronounce as English speakers because we're not used to forming that sound in this way. So you might need to practice these particular combinations a little bit more. ¿Cuáles? ¿Cuáles? Again, we have the CU that makes the qu sound with the A there. And on the end of the word, in English, we've been trained to ignore ES and just make the S sound. But in Spanish, the vowels always make a sound, so we have to say es. When you see ES on the end of a word, you have to say es. Okay, ¿cuáles? Cuello, cuello. Again, we have the CU, the qu sound with the E, and then the ella. Niña, niña. We have the ñ, and we also have the letter A on the end. Now make sure you say niña, because if you say niño, that's a different meaning. If you make that A into an O, that's a totally different meaning. It's a different gender. Okay. Zona, zona. We don't make the Z sound in Spanish. Música, música. Okay, we have to make sure we say the U as a U, mu, and also the accent mark tells us to place the emphasis on that first syllable. And because this is a cognate, we always want to pronounce the S like the Z sound, like in music, but we can't do that in Spanish, so it's música. We have to say the S sound without making that Z sound. Now, keeping these things in mind, here's how we're going to progress when we're reading phrases and longer passages in Spanish. The first thing we're going to do, if possible, if there's a listening component to this, we're going to listen until we can follow along in reading so that we're not getting lost in the text as somebody's reading this passage aloud or this phrase aloud, and we can actually hear the words and comprehend what's being said. We also would love to be able to get to a point where we can close our eyes and listen and understand everything that's being said. All right, this is a stage that infants and toddlers go through, and this is a stage that you need to go through as well. We need to be able to understand what's being said. Now, once you've mastered the listening, if it's available for the passage that you're trying to read or sound out, then you can go back and sound it out and begin speaking, okay, and imitating and repeating. All right, so when we're reading aloud, we're going to listen and repeat. Now, for a long paragraph in a book, or even a short phrase if you're just starting out, this may seem daunting. This is a huge combination of sounds all strung together. So what we have to do is, just like when we were learning our sight words and our vocabulary, we break it into small chunks and learn a piece at a time. And when we do this, it's going to build that fluency, and eventually you'll get to a point where things just flow and you can understand and read aloud long passages without having to break it into small chunks. The chunks will get bigger as you progress in your skills, but at first we may need to break things into very small chunks and just little pieces at a time, string these sounds together. So for this example, I have tu mamá está en casa. Okay, tu mamá está en casa. Now that sounds kind of all strung together really fast, but what you will do is, if you're looking at something on a video or listening to something on a sound recording, you're going to use your stop and play buttons and let's see, the replay, if you have a replay, and pause to listen to just chunks of that at first. So the first chunk you might want to listen to is tu mamá. Tu mamá. Oh, now tu mamá. I can hear the tu and the mamá, okay? Then we'll add the está. Tu mamá está. Tu mamá está. Okay? And then, rather than trying to get the end separate because those two sounds are kind of strung together, we'll just go learn that. So we'll hear en casa. En casa. And we'll do the same thing when we're trying to speak this. Once we can hear all of those sounds, we'll break it into chunks. And we'll try to repeat, tu mamá, tu mamá. And then we'll try to repeat, tu mamá está, tu mamá está. And then we'll try to repeat, en casa, en casa. And then we can put it all together. Tu mamá está en casa. Tu mamá está en casa. Okay? So we'll break it into chunks and then put the chunks together to make the whole phrase. And even if you're reading a whole paragraph, you can do this and just start at the beginning and slowly add on. And eventually you will be able to say the whole paragraph. Be sure you're understanding first, so you'll be able to understand it first, and then you can speak it. If it's available, watch the face to see how the sounds are formed. But then we want you to get to the point where you close your eyes and you're speaking so that you're really focusing on the sounds that you're making, because what we're really trying to do is understand that sounds are meaning. Okay, it's not the printed words that are meaning here, because we want to communicate in Spanish. We want to be fluent Spanish speakers and fluent in understanding spoken Spanish, so we have to focus on the sound. So close your eyes and imitate the sounds that you hear. And just remember, divide and conquer, and you will be successful at becoming fluent in Spanish.